Welcome to Order Militarist Radio TV, and we here are lifelong Catholics. What we do here is for free, and we don't make money doing this. All the funds we get from your subscription helps us get new equipment. I want to thank you all for helping us get these microphones, new speakers. But if you want us to have a better camera thing where I don't look slow, you buy your subscription donations, we can do this. And so we welcome Brother Alexis Bonolo to the show to talk about a very special topic.
Thank you, AJ, for having me on. It's always a pleasure and honor to be on Order Militaris Radio TV, restoring the whole concept of Catholic journalism and the apostolate, since we're doing this for the love of our Lord Jesus Christ. And today we're going to talk about, you could use many different names to name what we're going to talk about, but let's use a name that sums it all up, and we'll tell you how do we get there, okay? Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about the Fourth Reich, okay? Hitler, before he died, was asked, what will become of the National Socialist Party, the Nazi Party? Is this the end, as Germany was collapsing? And he said, no. The Nazi Party shall return, but not as a political organization, as a religion, in 100 years. Mm-hmm. Now we'll begin in 1919, because in 1919 was founded the Nazi Party, and 2019 was the 100th anniversary. And this is not a coincidence. So we're going to explain to you why the COVID-19 scamdemic is the beginning of the Fourth Reich and who's involved. And the story all begins with E.H. Harryman. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so AJ, tell us, who was E.H. Harryman? I mean, I know a lot of American history, but I hadn't heard of this guy's name 2 days ago. And you probably haven't heard of him either, okay? And this is a name you need to know.
H.E. Harryman was born on February 20th, 1848, in Hempstead, New York, son of Orlando Harryman Sr. Now, when Harryman was 50 years old in 1897, he became the director of the Union Pacific Railroad. By 1898, he was chairman of the executive committee. From that time until his death, his word was the law of the Union Pacific system. In 1903, he assumed the office of president of the company. From 1901 to 1909, Harryman was also the president of the Southern Pacific Railroad. The vision of unified UP and SP Railroad was planted with Harryman. The UP and SP was reunited on September 11, 1996. So.
And he dies when?
He dies September 9th, 1909.
Okay, so Harryman was a successful stockbroker on Wall Street. He was of middle class, but his career skyrocketed after marrying into a wealthy family, and her name was Averill.
Yeah, Mary Williamson Averill, daughter of William J. Averill, the banker in Ogdensburg, New York.
Mm-hmm. Who was involved in railroads in New York, and he marries her and gets capital from that marriage to buy a bankrupt railroad, which he fixes up and sells to the Pennsylvania Railroad for Penn Central Railroad for a hefty profit. And he starts doing that and amasses a lot of wealth until he's taken on to these big boards of directors. Now, one thing to know about Harryman is he was Skull and Bones, Yale, okay? And when he dies, his estate was worth, in modern day money, $2.3 $5 billion, utterly wealthy. In money of those days, it was only about maybe 150, 160 million.
Mm-hmm.
And he has two sons. And one is Averil Harryman, named after he gave one of his sons as a first name, the surname of his wife. Can you imagine? That's how grateful he was for the money. Averil Harryman. What do we know about Averil Harryman?
Yeah, let's see here. Hmm. Abraham. Okay, yeah, William Averill Harriman. Born November 15th, 1891. And they don't call him William, but call him is Averill Harriman. Was an American Democrat politician, businessman, and diplomat. And he served as the Secretary of Commerce under President Harry S. Truman, and later as the 48th governor of New York. So,
Now, tell us something about his early life and his career, because this will set the stage for the narrative.
yep. He's the son of Edward Henry Harriman and Mary Williamson Averill. He was the brother of E. Roland Harriman and Mary Harriman Rumsey. Harriman was a close second friend of Hall Roosevelt, the brother of Eleanor Roosevelt. During the summer of 1899, Harriman's father organized the Harriman Alaskan expedition, a philanthropic scientific survey of coastal Alaska and Russia that attracted 25 of the leading scientific naturalists and artist luminaries of the day, including John Muir, John Burroughs, George Bird Grinnell, C. Hart Merriman, Grove Carl Gilbert, and Edward Curtis, along with 100 family members and staff. Aboard the steamship George Elder, young Harriman would have his first introduction to Russia, a nation on which he would spend a significant amount of attention in his later life and public service. He attended Groton School in Massachusetts before going on to Yale, where he joined the Skull and Bones Society. He graduated in 1913. After graduating, he inherited one of the largest fortunes in America and became Yale's youngest crew coach.
Okay, now Skull and Bones is a Masonic lodge. It is called Skull and Bones and not Masonic Lodge because in the 1830s, the state of Connecticut outlawed the Masonic Lodge, and the Masonic Lodge on the campus of Yale changed its name. And Skull and Bones, my father studied at Yale, and he told me about it. It's a building without any windows, and it is by invitation only, and only the sons of the most powerful families are invited. And you can only become a member by doing some kind of obscene satanic act in the presence of others to witness it. And that the witnessing of you doing that is what gives them power over you for the rest of your life because they can reveal what you did. And it is said that it is an act of sodomy or pedophilia. Okay. And they have all kinds of crazy things in there. They have skulls.
Mm-hmm.
Did you read? They actually have a collection of skulls.
Yeah,
and,
skulls. Even the great Indian warrior Geronimo's skull.
Yeah. So it's not cold skull. And we're going to see the symbol Skull and Bones again, not by accident, elsewhere. So what does he do with his fortune? Because remember, his father dies in 1909. So after he graduates college, he comes of age and gets his fortune. What does he do with his fortune? This
is going to be fun. Using money from his father, he established W.A. Harryman and Company banking business in 1922. In 1927, his brother Roland joined the business, and the name was changed to Harryman Brothers and Company. In 1931, it merged with Brown Brothers and Company to create the highly successful Wall Street firm Brown Brothers Harryman and Company, and the notable employees include George Herbert Walker and his son-in-law Prescott Bush.
Now, Walker Bush. Do you mean Prescott Bush, the father of George Bush Sr. and grandfather of George Bush Jr.?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's, well, okay. They're also Skull and Bones members, aren't they?
Yep.
And the founders of Brown Brothers Harriman, I think there was 16 partners, and according to Wikipedia, 11 of them were Skull and Bones.
Mm-hmm.
So this is as Masonic a Masonic bank you could get, okay? And Brown Brothers Harriman still exists, okay? And I think they manage, if I'm correct, they manage $2.4 trillion in assets, or was it 6 trillion in assets? So
Yeah.
this is one of the biggest investment houses in the world. And I can tell you, because I have two members who worked in finance, they have never mentioned the name of Harriman Brothers. I mean, you hear of all the Jewish ones, but I've never heard of Harriman Brothers. And 6.2 trillion in assets is not, you know, your mother's fixins, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Got to remember, the U.S. gross national product is only, I think, 25 trillion. So they're managing assets equivalent to 1/4 of the national gross product.
Yep.
That means they're managing the assets of all the elites of our country, pretty much.
Yeah.
Well, the elites of our country probably have a lot more than that, okay? They probably have 10 times that, but they're managing at least a good chunk of all the wealth and power in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And this investment house was founded by 11 members of Skull and Bones.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as Catholics, we know what the Masons are. They're a society founded in 1717 between a group of Protestants that wanted to destroy Christianity and a group of Jews who wanted to destroy Christianity. And their objective is the destruction of Christianity. So this is no small thing. So what does Brown Brothers Harriman do in these years that really start, well, we might say, almost as if they start controlling the history of the United States?
Yeah.
So what does Brown Brothers Harriman do in the 30s?
In 1930s, the company acted as a U.S. base for German industrialist Fritz Thyssen, who helped finance Adolf Hitler.
Okay, so a little background here. Thyssen, you probably never heard of it. But Thyssen was, I think he was like a Dutch-German nobleman.
Mm-hmm.
And his family ran a small bank in the Rhineland. Okay, and the Rhineland is the part of Germany on west side of Germany along the Rhine River. And that area that is further to the west of the Rhine River is called the Ruhr or Saarland, and it's where all the coal and iron in Germany comes from. It's the heavy industry. And by some foreclosure or something, they get a hold of shares to a coal company, and they get involved in coal and steel, and they run some factories in Bavaria. And steel prices were very inflated in Germany when their family entered the business, so they made a lot of profit. And after the First World War, okay, we're saying about 1919, 1920, they engineer a unification of all the coal and steel companies, pretty much. I think it's something like 80 or good chunk of the German industry in coal and steel under their control, and they come to control all of it. And they get the financing for this takeover from the United States.
Yep.
I think I read it was like $8 billion in gold. So someone was funneling enormous amounts of money to Thyssen, who was a nobody, to take control of German steel and iron manufacturing. And the interesting thing is the history of Adolf Hitler. I don't know if you know, Adolf Hitler just didn't pop on the scene when he started the push in Bavaria. He was a corporal in the German army in the First World War. And he actually served in France, and he actually sired a bastard who, unbeknownst to him, lived and all the way until the 60s. It was his mother hit him, though. Some interesting things about he served in the Somme battle against the British.
Yeah.
And at one point, the British attacked his unit. And what was the curious thing that happened?
It launched, the artillery raids were awful in the Psalms, and well, he was a runner, messenger, carrying a message, and somehow all those in and around the message bunker were killed by the explosion, but only he had a slight injury to his leg.
So all the people who knew him were killed. And he alone survives.
Yeah.
And it was the British who did it.
Yep.
How convenient.
And
well, after the war, it was very advised that he side, because after the war, what does Hitler do? He joins military intelligence. He wasn't just a quack-headed, stupid person. He was viewed by the German army after the war as being very intelligent in military intelligence. And what do they assign him to do? They assign him to organize anti-communist spies to infiltrate the labor unions in the Saarland to prevent the Marxist takeover of the coal and steel industry.
Yeah.
Well, isn't that coincidental? Because here you have all this money from Brown Brothers Harriman flowing to Germany to Thyssen so he could take over the coal and steel industry. And magico presto, on the scene, there's Adolf Hitler. And, well, a few years later, I think it was von Hindenburg, the German nobleman, introduces Thyssen to Adolf Hitler. And from that point on, Thyssen becomes a supporter of the Nazi Party. So this is, can we say it's there's just too many connections to be coincidences here?
Yeah.
Hitler was the perfect, he was the perfect man for the job, because if you own the steel and iron industry and you want to make money, then you need things to happen that need steel, iron, and coal. Now, what do you need to happen that's going to use lots of steel and coal?
A war.
Another world, right? Another world war. And but if the money behind it was coming from the U.S., then they wouldn't want a world war where Germany won, would they?
No.
And who could they possibly get to lead Germany into world war and destroy Germany? Would he'd have to somehow not be a German, right? Because he'd be betraying his own country. And is Hitler German?
Bohemian.
Exactly, yeah. But what is his actual ethnicity?
Jewish.
And all his 4 grandparents are Jewish. How convenient. Remember, as we said, the Masonic Lodge is an alliance between Protestants and Jews to destroy Christians. Now, the funny thing is that the war does break out, and Thyssen does help Adolf Hitler. Matter of fact, Thyssen starts an electric company that supplies Auschwitz. So here you have a company in the US financing a company in Germany that's giving electricity to Auschwitz. Regardless of what you think happened at Auschwitz, we're talking war crimes here.
Yeah.
And in 1942, the Roosevelt administration investigated Brown Brothers Harriman and found them guilty of collaborating with the Third Reich after hostilities broke out. And the recommendation to Roosevelt was to confiscate the assets of Brown Brothers Harriman. But what happened?
Nothing.
None of his property was confiscated. Isn't that amazing?
Oh, yeah.
So let's go back to the life of William Averill Harriman and read out what happened in the rest of his life. What did he do, just to fill out this part of the story before we start talking about the other actors.
And Harriman's main properties included Brown Brothers Harriman Company, Union Pacific Railroad, Merchant Shipbuilding Corporation, venture capitalist investments that included the Polaroid Corporation. Ah, the same people making the vaccine, too. Harriman's associated properties, including the Southern Pacific Railroad, including the Central Pacific Railroad, Illinois Central Railroad, Wells Fargo Company, the Pacific Mail Steamship Corporation, American Ship and Commerce, the Hamburg Amerikanische Päckerei Gesellschaft, or HAPAG, whatever that is, American Hawaiian Steamship Company, United American Lines, the Guarantee Trust Company, the Union Banking Corporation. He also served as chairman of the Business Council, known as the Business Advisory Council for the United States Department of Commerce in 1937 and 1939.
Wow, this guy was amazingly powerful and wealthy. I can see why he was never prosecuted.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, he's Skull and Bones, so everyone else Skull and Bones is in league with him.
Mm-hmm.
So, Prescott Bush. Maybe we'll talk about the Bushes, and then we'll get to some of the other people he loaned money to.
Yeah.
So Prescott Bush, Herbert Walker was from St. Louis, and when Prescott Bush married his daughter, they both went to New York City and they just happened to start working for Harriman.
Mm-hmm.
But let's follow the history of Prescott Bush
and
the Bush dynasty. Now, you were all told that the Bush family from Texas, right?
Oh, yeah.
Weren't you told that?
Yeah.
But they're actually a New York family. More or less. Let's hear. Prescott Bush. Who was he? Where was he born? Where did he go to school?
Yep. Prescott Bush, born in Columbus, Ohio to Samuel Prescott Bush, and Florida Sheldon Bush. Samuel Bush was a railroad middle manager, then steel company president, and during World War I, also a federal government official in charge of coordination of and assistance to major weapons contractors. Bush attended St. George's School in Middletown, Rhode Island. He enrolled in Yale College, where his paternal grandfather, James Smith Bush, class of 1844, and his maternal uncle, Robert E. Sheldon Jr., class of 1904, had matriculated through subsequent generations of Bush family. Had been Yale alumni. Prescott Bush was admitted to the Zeta Psi fraternity and Skull and Bones secret society. George H.W. Bush was also a member of the society, as is his son George W. Bush.
Okay, let's stop there. So Prescott Bush, born in Ohio, studies at Yale, but you said something that made me pop my eyes open. He went to St. George's School in Middletown, Rhode Island?
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, which is the town immediately to the north of that. So I never went to St. George's, but I think my brother went there for a year. It's an Anglican school, very elite. And boy, that's a small world. Okay. And so at Yale, he's Skull and Bones. And what years was he at Yale? Do you have the years he studied at Yale?
Let's see here.
What year he graduated, at least?
Let's see here. Doesn't say.
Interesting. Okay. But he was born in what year?
1895.
So 1895 add 20, so that would be 1915.
Yeah.
Hey, Didn't Averell Harriman graduate from Yale in 1916?
Yeah.
So that means he and Prescott were in Skull and Bones together in the same
Mm-hmm.
years. So the fact that that Prescott ends up hired at Brown Brothers Harriman is no coincidence at all.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and he didn't hire them just as a worker. This guy's a friend and lodge member. So this is not some distant relationship. This is a close relationship. And I think Prescott ends up to be one of the partners of Brown Brothers Harriman with a good stake in the company, no?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that means Prescott Bush was involved in all the dealings with Thyssen and
Mm-hmm.
Adolf Hitler. And you notice Prescott Bush's qualifications, his father had been in the steel industry.
Mm-hmm.
So Brown Brothers and Harriman is funding a steel company in Germany. So that means Prescott Bush most likely worked at the desk that funded Thyssen, because it
Yep.
would have to know what all this money's going for steel factories.
Mm-hmm.
This is deeply disturbing. Deeply.
Yeah.
So what does Prescott Bush do at Harriman? Do we know anything about it, or what's his later life?
I found this interesting when he was just in the First World War. He served as a captain, field artillery captain with the American forces in the First World War. And then he received intelligence training at Verdun, France. Was briefly assigned to a staff of French officers, alternating between intelligence and artillery. So he was an intelligence officer as well.
Prescott Bush was in military intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. Well, you know, his son, George Bush Sr., ends up as head of CIA.
Mm-hmm.
And Adolf Hitler was also in military intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And Prescott Bush was the guy who was probably working at the desk that funding Thyssen, that supported Adolf Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
So Prescott Bush and Adolf Hitler are we could say, the first points of contact between American military intelligence and German military intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And they were allies.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see that this is very important when we come to what happens to the Nazi spy network after the war. So did they whitewash the history of Prescott Bush during the 30s or 40s, or do we know something more about it?
Let's see here. In 1924, Bush became vice president of the investment bank A. Harryman and Company, where his father-in-law, George Herbert Walker, was president. Bush's Yale classmates, fellow bondsmen E. Roland Harryman and Knight Woolley also worked with the company. In 1925, he joined the United States Rubber Company in New York as manager of foreign division and moved to Greenwich, Connecticut. In 1931, he became a partner of Brown Brothers Harriman and Company, which was created through the 1931 amalgamation of A. Harriman and Company with Brown Brothers Company, a merchant bank founded in Philadelphia in 1818, and with Harriman Brothers Company established in New York City in 1927. So he was a partner.
And it's interesting that they acquire Brown Brothers 2 years after the stock market crash. We'll come back to the stock market crash, and I can give you some personal information from that, about that. And so how about Prescott Bush's activities in the corporation after that merger?
Uh, Bush was a founding and one of the 7 directors, including W.H. Averill Harriman of the Union Banking Corporation, holding a single share out of 4,000 as a director, an investment bank that operated on clearing houses for many assets enterprise held by German steel magnate Fritz Thyssen. In July 1942, the bank was suspected of holding gold on behalf of Nazi leaders.
Oh, they were smuggling Nazi gold out of Germany.
Yeah.
Okay, and what is Prescott? Let's follow Prescott's history now, all up to the 60s.
Okay. Okay. Prescott Bush was politically active on social issues. He was involved in the American Birth Control League as early as 1942.
The Birth Control League?
Mm-hmm.
You mean the Planned Parenthood allied organization?
Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting.
He served as the treasurer of the first nationwide campaign of Planned Parenthood in 1947.
Prescott served with Planned Parenthood? I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is going to come back when we come to Bill Gates, which we'll discuss later in the show.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is not by coincidence. Now I'll mention it since it's become so evident. Well, William Abel Harryman, his buddy from Skull and Bones, Yale, used all this money to start William Harriman Brothers. But his mother got a chunk of the father's estate too. And Mrs. Averill is the founder of the Eugenics League, the Eugenics Board, which goes on and becomes Planned Parenthood.
Mm-hmm.
So Prescott's involvement in Planned Parenthood is not by coincidence. He's merely serving the interests of the mother of his friend.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep.
Oh, and I'll mention the Eugenics Board, as we did from our program on Margaret Sanger, was totally in league with the Nazis to create the super race and get rid of, exterminate the lesser races. And this is why the theme is returned in the COVID scamdemic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Then he gets into politics. He goes from a Democrat to a Republican from 1947 to 1950. He served as Connecticut Republican Finance Chairman and was a Republican candidate for the United States Senate in 1950. A columnist in Boston said that Bush is coming on to be known as President Truman's Harry Hopkins. Nobody knows Mr. Bush, and he hasn't a Chinaman's chance. Harry Hopkins had been one of Franklin D. Roosevelt's closest advisors. Bush's ties with Planned Parenthood also hurt him in strongly Catholic Connecticut and were the basis of a last-minute campaign in churches by Bush's opponents. The family vigorously denied the connection, but Bush lost to Senator William Benetton by only 1,000 votes. Prescott Bush sought a rematch with Senator Benton in 1952, but withdrew as the party turned to William Pertell. The death of Senator Brian Mahone later that year, however, created a vacancy, and that time the Republicans nominated Bush. He defeated Democrat nominee Abraham Rippikoff, was elected to the Senate, a staunch supporter of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and served until January 1963. He was re-elected in 1956 with 55% of the vote over Democrat Thomas J. Dodd, later U.S. Senator from Connecticut and father of Christopher J. Dodd. He decided not to run for another term in 1962. He was a key ally for the passage of Eisenhower's interstate highway system. During his tenure, supported the Polaris submarine project built by Electric Boat Corporation in Groton, Connecticut, civil rights legislation, and establishment of the Peace Corps. And on December 2nd, 1954, Prescott Bush was part of the large 67 to 22 majority to censure Wisconsin Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy.
Stop right there. Stop right. Prescott Bush voted to censure McCarthy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we just did a show on Joe McCarthy. And what did we learn about the people who voted to reprove him?
Yeah. They were all communists.
Or that they were Freemasons, right?
Yep.
Now, I thought the Bush family was from Texas, but here this guy's running as senator in Connecticut. What other famous families from Connecticut that's in the news?
Let's see. Biden? He's Delaware.
Now, Biden's Delaware. No, it's Hillary.
Hillary Clinton.
Her family's from Connecticut. Yeah,
Mm.
her family's from Connecticut. Interesting. And what year did Prescott Bush become a senator? Does it say there? For the first time?
Let's see, later that year, however. So about 1952, 1953.
Now, this is very interesting because it was in the years 50-52 that Avery Dulles founds, not Avery Dulles, but the Dulles who is appointed head of the CIA and merges U.S. military intelligence with the entire Nazi spy network that comes to the east.
Mm-hmm.
And here we have in the Senate at the same time Prescott Bush, who helped finance Adolf Hitler in military intelligence, and he was in U.S. military intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of hard to believe that he wouldn't have been totally behind that.
Yeah.
So the entire Nazi echelon, the spy network, which you might say is the creme de la creme of the Nazi party, doesn't get destroyed with the war. They don't get captured.
Mm-hmm.
They don't get imprisoned. They get recruited. And that through the Harrimans and the Dulleses, they actually enter into the U.S. government.
Yeah.
And they find strong support from the families that have always supported Planned Parenthood, eugenics, and fascism.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. So what's the rest of the career of Prescott Bush? Now we know that Eisenhower was big on cooperating. He's the one that actually decided to recruit the Nazis, and he was big on collaborating with the Russians. Who was the person most feared by Eisenhower as someone running against him for the presidency and probably could have beat him? We did a program on him. General
Patton. Right.
And we talked at length about that, didn't we? That George Patton was most likely assassinated
Yeah.
by U.S. military intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
which was now Nazi military intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
so that he couldn't run for the presidency and defeat Eisenhower. And as far as we know, Patton was never a member of the Masonic Lodge. He might have had strange ideas of religion, but he wasn't a Freemason. So there's just a bit too many
Yeah.
coincidences here. So he goes on in the Senate, and he's a strong supporter of Eisenhower. And what else does he do?
In terms of issues, Bush was often agreed with New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. According to Theodore H. White's book about the 1964 presidential election, Bush and Rockefeller were longtime friends. Bush favored a Nixon-Rockefeller ticket for 1960 and was presumed to support Rockefeller's 1964 presidential candidacy until the later remarriage in 1963. He then publicly denounced Rockefeller for divorcing his first wife and marrying a woman with whom Rockefeller had been having an affair while married to his first wife. Bush then very publicly endorsed his former Senate colleague, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who was also
Okay. Okay, so Prescott Bush supported the Rockefeller-Nixon ticket in 1960.
Mm-hmm.
And now we know the Rockefellers are totally behind COVID-19, the lockstep program, and the whole idea of world domination.
Yep.
Who did not? I know, I've heard the name Nixon. I didn't know Rockefeller was his vice presidential candidate in 1960. But Nixon doesn't become president in 1960. He's defeated by
Uh,
a Catholic, right?
JFK.
JFK. So let's just pause it right here. And JFK, as you know, was assassinated.
Yep.
And what was the day? It was November 1960.
November 1963.
1963, the exact day and place. Let's talk real hard facts now.
It was Dallas, Texas. And
Need
yeah,
to look it up.
yeah. Okay, let's get this right here. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, was assassinated on Friday, November 22nd, 1963, at 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time in Dallas, Texas. While riding in the presidential motorcade through Dealey Plaza, Kennedy was riding with his wife, Jacqueline, Texas Governor John Connally, and Connally's wife, Nellie, when he was finally shot.
Okay, and the day of the month again was?
November 22nd, 1963.
November 22nd, 1963. Now, I think it was about a month or two before this that Kennedy says that he's going to exterminate the Masonic Lodge from military bases. He was going to remove the Masonic Lodge from military bases because he didn't want the Masonic Lodge controlling the U.S. military.
Mm-hmm.
And Prescott Bush is Skull and Bones.
Yeah.
And Harryman serves in the administration of Truman.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a very suspicious photo, I have seen it, of the people standing outside of the storage building where the alleged shooter shot from on November 22nd, 1963.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a young man standing there. And, well, he looks a lot like Bush,
Mm-hmm.
George Bush, the son of Prescott.
Yeah.
Now, that may not be true, but there's a report saying that George Bush, the son of Prescott, had a meeting about an hour from Dallas the night before, and they drank a lot, and the discussion was how to get rid of President Kennedy.
Mm-hmm. And that was also reported on by a fellow Catholic and former intelligence officer, Gregory Carpenter, for the Mike Church's radio station, Veritas Radio Network, Reverse Deception, in a 3-hour program. He goes through it all.
Now, we know that Johnson, who succeeds Kennedy, was a Freemason, and I think the Warren Commission, nearly all the members were Freemasons.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the coincidences, do we really have to spell them out? It is long thought that the alleged shooter, what his name? The name of the alleged shooter?
Lee Harvey Oswald.
It was long thought that he did it by himself, but recent studies in the last decade shows that he was actually a member of a CIA op being trained out of Louisiana to assassinate Fidel Castro.
Yep.
And that they were given specialty training, and he wasn't considered an expert on the gun, but we'll never know his story because it just happens that he was shot dead some days later. Well, isn't that very convenient? I wonder if the guy who shot him was a Freemason. And the guy who shot him, I think, commits suicide.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very convenient too.
Jack Ruby was the shooter who shot Oswald, and Ruby died in prison while waiting a new trial.
By suicide, or did he was just found dead.
Yeah, he was found dead in his prison cell.
That's very convenient. Don't you, doesn't it seem that the Masons have all the luck?
Mm-hmm.
So the guy who came up with the crazy idea that this one bullet caused all the wounds, Alan Spector, he goes on to become senator of Pennsylvania for life, basically. He only recently left office, and I think he's passed away now.
Yeah.
But he got a big reward for that theory. And detailed studies of the timing of the, I think it was called the Zapruder film.
Mm-hmm.
The Zapruder film was confiscated, so no one would know about it for like 30 years. But when it finally was recovered, they found out that the timing of the frames and of the sound of the shots shows that there is no way that Lee Harvey Oswald could have seen the head of JFK because there was a tree obstructing his view at the moment of the gunfire.
Mm-hmm.
And there are sounds of other shots coming from the fenced area nearby. I think I read somewhere that it was the head of the CIA or Johnson himself who decided, or was it, I forget who decided the actual route of the motorcade. I think it was the vice president himself, who didn't observe any constitutional protocol and immediately had himself declared president on the plane flight back.
Mm-hmm.
And then they didn't allow any autopsy of the body. So to this day, we don't know if he was shot by one gun or several guns. But certainly these, well, what did you hear about that?
From listening, it is my favorite episode of Reverse Deception to listen to. They actually did look at the clothing of JFK and found 3 bullet holes. One in the back of the neck and 2 in the front.
Well, one bullet can't come out 2 holes.
Mm-mm.
Mm-hmm. And then the brain of JFK gets stolen from the National Archives.
Yep. Supposedly by Skull and Bones.
How convenient is that? I mean, boy, you're really getting convenient here. We know that with the assassination of JFK, politics in Washington takes a decidedly different turn of events. It's much more separate from the American people. It doesn't really reflect our values anymore. And we have increasingly, what could we call it? Almost psychopathic behavior out of the presidents. I think Reagan was about the only president who was really in favor of the American people. And guess what? Who was his vice president?
George Herbert Walker Bush.
And presto magico, someone tries to assassinate Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
And they failed, thanks be to God. But was Bush at his side when the gunshots came out?
Nope.
Well, how convenient is that? Now, who would have become president if Reagan was assassinated?
Bush.
How convenient is that? Really? And let's now finish the career of Prescott Bush and read something about the early life of George Walker Bush and see how he ends up as vice president to Ronald Reagan.
Okay. Yeah. See what we got here. So, this is from Fox News, published October 17th, 2003. Documents Bush grandfather directed bank tied to man who funded Hitler. So, yeah. But then let's go back to the Prescott and keep learning about him. He was in favor. Blah, blah, blah. Bush voted in favor of the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960, as well as the 24th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Another of Senator Bush's major legislative interests was flood and hurricane protection. He drafted Public Law 71, the Bush Hurricane Survey Act, enabling U.S. Army engineers to develop a new program of community protection against tidal flooding. And that is all his.
Okay, so let's talk about his son, Bush Sr.
Yep.
When was he born? Where did he go to school? When did he graduate from Yale? And what did he do in business? And how did he get involved in politics?
Yep. He was born June 12th, 1924. November 30th, 2018, he passed away. He was a diplomat. He was
Where was he born?
Greenwich, Connecticut, and attended Phillips Academy. And let's see here. Then he went into after he got out of Phillips Academy in an elite private academy in Massachusetts from 1937 to 1942. While at Phillips Academy, he served as president of the senior class, secretary of student council, president of the community fundraising group, member of the editorial board of the school newspaper, captain of varsity baseball soccer teams. On his 18th birthday, immediately after graduating from Phillips Academy, he enlisted in the United States Navy as a naval aviator. After a period of training, he was commissioned as an ensign in the Naval Reserve at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi on June 9, 1943, becoming one of the youngest aviators in the Navy. Beginning in 1944, Bush served in the Pacific Theater, where he flew a Grumman TBF Avenger, a torpedo bomber, typical taking off from aircraft carriers. His squadron was assigned to the U.S. San Jacinto as a member of the Air Group 51, where his lanky physique earned him the nickname Skin. Bush flew his... So he was... He flew his first combat mission in 1944, bombing Japanese-held Wake Island. Promoted to lieutenant junior grade on August 1st, 1944. During the attack on a Japanese installation of Chikajima, Bush's aircraft successfully attacked several targets posed down by enemy fire. Though both of Bush's fellow crew members died, Bush successfully bailed out from the aircraft and was rescued by the U.S. Finback. Several of the aviators shot down during the attack were captured and executed, and their livers were eaten by their captors. Bush's near-death experience shaped him profoundly, leading him to ask, "Why had I been spared, and what did God have for me?" He was later awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role in the mission. Bush returned to San Jacinto in November 1944, participating in operations in the Philippines. In early 1945, he was assigned to a new combat squadron, VT-153, where he trained to take part in the invasion of mainland Japan. On September 2nd, 1945, before any invasion took place, Japan formally surrendered following the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Bush was released from active duty that same month, but was not formally discharged from the Navy until October 1955, at which point he had reached the rank of lieutenant. Then he met Barbara Pierce at the Christmas dance in Greenwich in December 1941, and after a period of courtship, they became engaged in December 1943. While Bush was on leave from the Navy, they married in Rye, New York on January 6, 1945. Bush The Bushes enjoyed a strong marriage, and Barbara would later become a popular First Lady, seen by many as a kind of national grandmother. The marriage produced 6 children: George W., Robin, Jeb, Neil, Marvin, Doral. Their oldest daughter, Robin, died of leukemia in 1953. Bush enrolled at Yale College, where he took part in an accelerated program that enabled him to graduate in 2.5 years. He was a member of the Delta Kappa and Upsilon fraternity and elected president. He was also captain of Yale's baseball team, played first 2 college World Series as a left-hand first baseman. Like his father, he was a member of the Yale cheerleading squad and was initiated in the Skull and Bones Secret Society.
He was a member of the male cheerleader squad.
Yep.
Like his father.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
And like also his father, also joined Skull and Bones.
Okay, so once he graduates from the fact that he could do Yale in 2.5 years in a special program while being captain of the baseball team, I find a bit hard to believe, having been at university myself. But I suppose if you're Skull and Bones, anything is possible. So what does he do once he graduates?
After he graduates, Bush moved his young family to West Texas. So his first position in Texas was an oil field equipment salesman for Dresser Industries, which was led by a family friend, Neil Mallon. While working for Dresser, Bush lived in various places with his family: Odessa, Ventura, Bakersfield, Compton, California, and Midland, Texas. In 1952, he volunteered for the successful presidential campaign of Republican candidate Dwight D. Eisenhower. That same year, his father won election to represent Connecticut in the United States Senate as a member of the Republican Party. With support from Mallon and Bush's uncle, George Herbert Walker Jr., Bush and John Overby launched the Bush-Overby Oil Development Company in 1951. In 1953, he co-founded the Zapata Petroleum Corporation, an oil company that drilled the Permian Basin in Texas. In 1954, he named president of the Zappa Offshore Company, a subsidiary which specialized in offshore drilling. Shortly after the subsidiary became independent in 1959, Bush moved the company and his family from Midland to Houston. In Houston, he befriended James Baker, a prominent attorney who later became an important political ally. Bush remained involved in the Zapata until the mid-1960s, when he sold his stock in the company for approximately $1 million. In 1988, the Nation published an article alleging Bush worked as an operative of the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, during the 60s.
Oh, so the fact that he was at Dallas the day of the assassination means he might have been there in his capacity as a CIA agent.
Yep.
And the shooter was a member of the CIA too.
Yep.
So Bush might have very well been the handler of one of the alleged assassin, even if the alleged assassin couldn't have done the shooting.
Yep.
Well, I don't need to comment on that to see how disturbing that is.
Mm-hmm.
Bush does now something in the 70s, doesn't he? Start an oil company in the 70s with a brother of a very famous person from the Mideast.
Let's see here.
Oh, is that his son that founds this company?
I think it's his son. Because in 60, he begins his political career in 1963. And who dies in 1963.
President Kennedy. So the Bush Sr. begins his political career the same year Kennedy is assassinated, when he happens to be in Dallas at that time.
Yep.
Or at least in Texas. Now, what does George Bush Sr. do after the 60s? What does he end up? How does he end up the vice president of Reagan?
Okay. 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 He was then okay, where are you at? There we go. He was vice president in 1980. As vice president, Bush generally maintained a low profile. Recognizing the constitutional limits of the office, he avoided decision-making or criticizing Reagan in any way. This approach helped him earn Reagan's trust, easing tensions left over their earlier rivalry.
Okay,
Bush,
okay. Now, wait, before we get to his as vice presidency, how did he become head of the CIA? Wasn't he head of the CIA before this?
yeah,
And how does he go from an oil magnate to head of the CIA? That's kind of strange.
yeah.
Or did they whitewash the history of that from his biography?
Uh, they washed that off. Says he goes straight to entry into politics as a U.S. representative from Texas, then into the Nixon-Ford administration, where he's the ambassador to the United Nations. Then he becomes the chairman of the Republican National Committee. And later on, he becomes the U.S. liaison office in China. Then in January 1976, Ford brought Bush back to Washington to become the director of Central Intelligence, placing him in charge of the CIA. In the aftermath of the Watergate scandal and the Vietnam War, the CIA's reputation had been damaged for its role in the various covert operations, and Bush was tasked with restoring the agency's morale and public reputation. During the Bush's year in charge of the CIA, the U.S. national security apparatus actively supported Operation Condor, operations in right-wing military dictatorships in Latin America. Meanwhile, Ford decided to drop Rockefeller from the ticket for the 1976 presidential election. Considered Bush as his running mate, but ultimately chose Bob Dole. In his capacity as DCI, Bush gave national security briefings to Jimmy Carter, both as a presidential candidate and as presidential-elect.
So Gerald Ford wanted to restore the image of the CIA, so he brings in the son of Prescott Bush, who was involved in dealings with Adolf Hitler, even though he was U.S. military intelligence, and forging an alliance with Hitler, which later would be used to get all the Nazi spies recruited into the U.S. government.
Mm-hmm.
And then as head of CIA, he supports Nazi-like organizations in Latin America that go down gunning down innocent people.
Mm-hmm.
In pure Nazi style. Do we do we have to even comment on this? How just mind-blowingly coincidental that is, or is it actually causative? And he runs against Reagan, but then patches it all up and becomes his VP. Isn't that convenient?
Yep.
And so he's there like the handler of Reagan.
Yeah.
During the 4 Reagan years. Okay, now you can talk about his vice presidency. Yeah.
Yeah. And the start off, he doesn't, he's just in the background, not criticizing Reagan, not doing anything to upset him.
I remember that. He was like he didn't exist. The newspapers were saying the vice president that isn't. I remember that.
Now get this. On March 30th, 1981, while Bush was in Texas, Reagan was shot and seriously wounded by John Hinckley Jr. Bush
No, wait, excuse me. Another president is nearly assassinated, and Bush is again in Texas, where he was during the first assassination of Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that just amazingly coincident?
Yeah.
Hinckley, yeah, Hinckley. Now, Hinckley was known to be unstable. He was intentionally let out of a prison for the criminally insane, and he was allowed to get a gun license
Mm-hmm.
6 months before. It's almost like and he had already said he wanted to kill the president. So it's almost like the CIA said, hey, we know this guy wants to kill the president. Let's let him out and let him do his thing. And when he
Mm-hmm.
comes to Washington, get our man out of town.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so continue with the assassination attempt.
So once the shots are fired and Reagan's bleeding and getting treatment by the Secret Service medics and everything, he gets word of it and he immediately flies back to DC. When his plane landed, his aides invited him to proceed directly to the White House by helicopter in order to show that the government was still functioning. But Bush rejected the idea, as he feared that such dramatic scenes risked giving the impression that he sought to usurp the Reagan powers and prerogatives. So during Reagan's short period of resting up and healing, Bush presided over the cabinet meetings, met with congressional leaders and foreign leaders, and briefed reporters, but he constantly rejected the possibility of invoking the 25th Amendment. Bush's handlings of the attempted assassination and its aftermath made a positive impression on Reagan, who recovered and returned to work within 2 weeks of the shooting. From then on, the two men would have regular Thursday lunches in the Oval Office.
Now, what day did this attempted assassination take place?
March 30th, 1981.
Now, that was the same year that John Paul II was nearly assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
That was within like 5 weeks. 5 weeks.
Yep.
And Bush actually gets more power after this assassination. Now Reagan is taking more counsel from him and is more friendly with them.
Mm-hmm.
So it had a benefit.
Yep.
And in fact, Bush goes on and becomes the next Republican candidate for presidency, and he's elected, which is rather unusual for a vice president to go on and become elected president after a two-term Republican president. Very unusual. Okay, so continue about Bush's career.
So Bush was assigned by Reagan to chair two special task forces, one on the deregulation and one on international drug smuggling. Both were popular issues with conservatives, and Bush, largely a moderate, began courting them through his work. The deregulation task force reviewed hundreds of rules, making specific recommendations on which ones to amend or revise in order to curb the size of the federal government. Reagan's administration deregulation push had a strong impact on broadcasting, finance, resource extraction, and other economic activities, and the administration eliminated numerous government positions. Bush also oversaw the Administration National Security Crisis Management Organization, what a mouthful, which had traditionally been responsibility of the National Security Advisor. In 1983, Bush toured Western Europe as part of Reagan's administration's ultimately successful efforts to convince skeptical NATO allies to support deployment of the Pershing second missiles. And it goes into the second term. talk about Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union in 1985, less ideological, rigid than his predecessors. Gorbachev believed that the Soviet Union urgently needed economic and political reforms. At the 1987 Washington summit, Gorbachev and Reagan signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which committed both signatories to the total abolition of their respective short-range, medium-range missile stockpiles. The treaty marked the beginning of a new era of trade, openness, and cooperation between the two powers. Though President Reagan and Secretary of State George Shultz took the lead in these negotiations, Bush sat on many meetings and promised Gorbachev that he would seek to continue improving Soviet-U.S. relations if he succeeded Reagan. On July 13, 1985, Bush became the first vice president to serve as acting president when Reagan underwent surgery to remove polyps from his colon. Bush served as the acting president for approximately 8 hours. In 1986, Reagan administration was shaken by the scandal when it was revealed that the administration officials had secretly arranged weapons sales to Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. Oh. The officials had used the proceeds to fund the anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua, which was a direct violation of law. When the news of the affair broke to the media, Bush, like Reagan, stated that he had been out of the loop, unaware of the versions of funds. Although this assertion has been since challenged. Biographer John Meekham writes that no evidence was ever produced proving Bush was aware of the versions to the Contras. But he criticized Bush's out-of-the-loop characterization. Reagan at the record is clear that Bush was aware that the United States, in contravention of its own stated policy, was trading arms for hostages. The Iran-Contra scandal, as it became known, did serious damage to the Reagan presidency, raising questions about Reagan's competency. Congress established a Tower Commission to investigate the scandal, and at Reagan's request, a panel of federal judges appointed Lawrence Walsh as the special prosecutor, charged with investigating the Iran-Contra scandal. The investigations continued after Reagan left office, and though Bush was never charged with the crime, the Iran-Contra scandal would remain a political liability for him.
And that's quite inconceivable to believe that the former head of the CIA had nothing to do with it. Oliver North was the man put in charge of this whole thing, and he swore before Congress, I'll never forget his words, that he did everything with the full backing of the White House, or at least what he believed he had. But he was told he had the backing of the White House. I don't think he ever spoke with either the president or the vice president. This is deep state op like 101, you know. It was quite scandalous, and this is what leads Bush not to win a second term as president. There was just too many doubts remaining over what was going on here.
Yeah.
And so that's George Bush, the presidency. Now his son.
Yeah.
We're picking up the thread again. Prescott Bush worked for the Harrymans and military intelligence, funded Adolf Hitler's rebuilding of the Third Reich, and even hid Nazi gold. Yeah. His son goes on to just happen to be there for the assassination of Kennedy, who wanted to wipe out the lodge. And then he ends up head of the CIA. Boy, that's amazing. And then, which is the union of the OSS and the Nazi spy network. I'm not saying the Nazis are alive anymore, but their spycraft there is. And we've talked about the MK project, which was a Nazi CIA project. And that involves mass psychological manipulation. Okay, so.
Oh, man.
Mass psychological. Now, how would you, what's the way to induce mass psychological manipulation in MK Ultra? Shock.
Yeah.
You shock someone with a horrible event, and you don't tell them what happened or what caused it. You tell them what you want them to think happened or caused it. And because of the shock, they never investigate it, and they follow your narrative, and you've now instrumentalized them to do what you want. So let's go back to the 70s. Bush Jr. starts an oil company.
Mm-hmm.
And he starts it with the brother of.
Okay.
Things are really going to get your head. You think you've heard something yet? Sit down and calm down, because you're going to need to be seated in this next section.
In 1977, George Bush Jr. established Arbusto Energy, a small oil exploration company. Although it did not begin operations until the following year, he later changed the name to Bush Exploration in 1984. His company was merged with larger Spectrum 7, and Bush became chairman. The company was hurt by decreased oil prices, and it folded into HKN Inc. Bush became a member of the HKN board of directors. Questions of possible insider trading involving HKN arose, but a Securities and Exchange Commission investigators concluded that the information Bush had at the time of his stock sale was not sufficient to constitute insider trading.
Okay, but Arbusto Oil, that article doesn't tell you who the partner was.
Mm-mm.
Isn't that convenient? But you know who the partner was?
No.
It was the brother of Osama bin Laden.
Ooh.
And from then on, the bin Laden family starts getting involved in all these projects with the CIA, promoting CIA ops throughout the Mideast. And we can't detail them precisely, but Russia invades Afghanistan in 91, I think, in the early 90s, and they're destroyed by that war in Afghanistan. It just, and oh no, it was in the 80s. It was in the 80s.
1980.
And in the 80s, right during the Reagan years. Isn't that amazing? And they get destroyed by that war. The army gets massacred in it, and because Afghanistan is just a terrible place to fight any war. Even Alexander had a hard time there.
Mm-hmm.
And the CIA supports the Osama bin Laden, to go to Afghanistan and start the Mujahideen and fight on behalf of the CIA against Russians. And trains them in all the spycraft, all the arts of terrorism. So here you have the head of a terrorist group in Afghanistan, whose brother is an oil company with George Bush.
Mm-hmm.
And this partner of his brother becomes Magico Presto, president of the United States. And you thought you chose your presidents.
Yeah.
So when does George Bush become president of the United States?
He becomes president in, let's see, 2001.
2001. Isn't that amazing?
Mm-hmm.
2001. And what happens in September 11th, 2001?
There's a supposed terrorist attack in New York City, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. with airplanes.
And who's supposed to be the head of this terrorist organization?
They said Osama bin Laden, but
does it seem credible that the brother of your business partner would attack your country as soon as you become president and you wouldn't know about it?
no.
Now, granted that Osama bin Laden had like 60 brothers, because in Islam you can have like a dozen wives, and it was a wealthy family, but it seems incredible, especially since Osama bin Laden is a CIA op, so they would have agents all around him all the time. And whatever happened to Osama bin Laden?
Supposedly he was shot in the face in a Navy SEAL raid.
But do we have any proof that that ever happened?
They said they didn't want to release any photographs to shock the people or cause a stir of emotions of other Islamic terrorist organizations.
How convenient is that? So we really have no proof he's dead other than the word of the government.
Yeah.
So now let's get to 9/11. Now, I knew when 9/11 took place that the government knew about it in advance, and I'll tell you how. Okay. Because on August 22nd, 2001, I happened to be in Quebec visiting a family devoted to the Latin Mass, and I decided it was a time to return back to my relatives in Massachusetts. So at 1 in the morning, I walked down to the border. It was a 20-mile walk, and by about sunrise, I hitched up the ride, and I entered the United States. And I have never had any problem entering the United States, except that day. And I was grilled. I was taken aside and questioned. I gave him my passport, but that wasn't enough. They were looking over me with where did you come from? How are you in Quebec? How did you get here? There's no way you could have walked 20 miles and blah, 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 and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And I understood they asked me what my religion was. And they asked me if I was a Muslim. Now here I am, a Franciscan in a habit with a rosary around my waist, and they asked me if I'm a Muslim. And admittedly, I was wearing a beard at the time, a rather bushy beard.
Mm-hmm.
So I said to myself when 9/11 happened, they knew to be on the lookout for Muslims. They knew it. They knew it 2 weeks before this attack.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we have to talk about the attack.
Yep.
And I watched the second plane go through the tower, what I thought was the second plane go through the tower. And I watched the whole thing on television. It was completely terrified. The Sunday after, everyone came out of the woodwork. You couldn't even get near the church. Cars were parked for miles in a distance from it. Everyone went to church. They were afraid that this was the end of the world and a huge war was going to be waged against us. Years later, I think it was 2004, 2006, a stewardess who had served for 30 years, having retired, decided to start reading up all the evidence. And since she was a stewardess and it was her profession, she had the natural and professional ability to see what was authentic and see what might be faked. And I think you're going to post the video on the site for this page, right, AJ?
Yeah.
What was her name?
Let's see here.
And what did she discover?
Let me go to it real quick. Okay, interview is Rebecca Roth. The interview is conducted by George Newley on Coast to Coast AM with 9/11 researcher, author, and now retired flight attendant Rebecca Roth.
And I watched the whole interview. If you want to watch anything about 9/11, now there are a lot of crazy theories about 9/11, but this is not a crazy theory about 9/11. And my training in anthropologist helps me understand that her testimony is absolutely devastating. Because what is the surest testimony when you're trying to figure out what happened? It's human testimony, okay? Because with human testimony, we have something that's absolutely evident. So it just happened that after 9/11, the government gave us 2 audio tapes, recordings of what 2 people said about what was going on, at least what several people said on each plane. It just happened that people on the planes were giving these 20-minute phone call messages, and the government gave us the transcription and even the recordings of some. Well, here's the strange thing. She had worked 30 years. She knew when you could make a phone call from a plane and with what kind of device. The planes from which, according to this, I think one of the government officials lost his wife in one of these planes. It was the Inspector General, I think, of the United States. His wife was on one of these planes, and when asked if she called him, he said yes. And then he asked, how did she call you? And he said, a cell phone. And then the press said, well, a cell phone doesn't work at 25,000 feet. You sure it was a cell phone? He said, no, it was an airphone. Well, this stewardess investigated it, and that plane had no airphones. They were decommissioned 6 months before. So then she started saying, this is impossible then, that these calls were made from 25,000 feet. And you couldn't even make a phone call from 2,000 feet with cell phones back then. But these phone calls are absolutely perfect without any interruptions. And what's even stranger, there's no cockpit sound. There's no sound of a plane flying in the background of these calls, which always happens, according to the stewardess.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this stewardess is not nuts. She wrote a book, and she had tens of thousands of pilots and stewardesses agree with her book because they're experts in this.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's analyzed every single thing said in these alleged transcripts. And her conclusion is, yes, the people who made the calls were the people who are said to have made the calls.
Mm-hmm.
But they did not make them from planes that were in the air. They made them from planes that were in a hangar. And it is established fact, because I know it was reported, that there were military games simulating air attacks that day throughout the Northeast. There was actually a company that was given connection to the US military radar with equipment that could simulate things in the air that weren't there and hide things that in the air that were there as part of the military games.
Mm-hmm.
It could simulate the movement of all these planes. And there are photos of the second plane hitting the tower. And the second plane hitting the tower has a device attached to the bottom of it that is not found on a normal plane. It's just not there. It's also not even the right make and model of the plane that is alleged to take off.
Mm-hmm.
So her conclusion, and you could listen to the link, as she wrote a whole book, is that these two planes had on them systems so that the US military could take control of the plane in case of a hijacking. And when this device took over the control of the planes, all communications would be wiped out and the plane would disappear from radar. And that these planes were landed at a US Air Reserve base, 20 minutes from Boston. And I think I could name it, but I'm not certain, so I won't. She says she names it in the book. And some interesting things about this base. When the towers were attacked, some personnel who were called up in case of national emergency and had the duty to go immediately to that base,
Mm-hmm.
found the base locked, found that all the personnel on the base had been ordered off for 2 days into a hotel, and they were not allowed to enter that base, even though it was their duty, according to national security protocols, to go into that base. So she's of the opinion the planes were landed at that base, and that they were told they were in a military exercise and they just had to fake these phone calls because it's part of the military exercise. And that the actual planes that took off are not the planes that flew into the towers.
Mm-hmm.
And I published this also from Rome. They have done studies of how difficult it is to steer at 500 miles an hour or 460 miles an hour into a tower that's only 26 feet wider than the wingspan of the plane. And expert pilots who have 30 years flying experience couldn't do it. One of them did it on the 10th try, And the guy who's alleged to have done it, the terrorists who are alleged to have done it, were not even allowed to fly a Cessna because they couldn't keep a plane straight at 60 miles an hour. So that means the men alleged to have done it could never have done it.
Mm-hmm.
He also found out that a few years after 2000, I think it was like 2004, there was a lawsuit brought by lawyers in Saudi Arabia against the US government. And the lawsuit was brought by 6 of the hijackers. And the hijackers, not for their estates, the lawyer didn't bring the lawsuit in the name of dead people. He brought the lawsuit in the name of alive people because he said these people aren't dead. They still live in Saudi Arabia. And they were never there in 2001. And she got conducted other evidence, whereas the car and the apartment that they allegedly rented in Boston were in the name of a man in Florida he was named in the first hours as one of the terrorists, but wasn't one of the terrorists. So her conclusion, and you'd have to get her book, I have not read her book, I only watched her thing, is that this was a complete deep state op. They blocked the normal reservations on those planes. There was only about 35 people on each plane, which is extremely low. And for a cross-nation flight is like they would have never flown, okay? They have to fly with at least 100 people to go bankrupt. And they landed these planes. They told people it was a military op. And then they gassed them all to death. They gassed every one of those passengers. No planes crashed. None of the planes that took off crashed in the towers or in Pennsylvania or in the Pentagon. The real passengers were all killed by the U.S. government or some organization in the U.S. government. And she has combined all the evidence. It's absolutely incontrovertible because what these people are doing and saying on the phones is totally irrational. For example, one of the stewardesses, whose voice is recognizable as in fact the stewardess, she says of another stewardess that he's upstairs. Well, there was no second story on that model plane, so he couldn't be upstairs. So there's so many things in the testimony that shows that they were being told what to say by people who were not stewardesses and didn't know what to say, and that they were saying things they would have never said in the professional capacity and doing things completely in violation of all their training for what to do in hijacking, which means that the U.S. military outfitted planes that were strong enough to pierce those towers and destroy them with explosives on board. Because the normal plane gets shredded by hail or even birds. It cannot fly through a steel structure, and the nose come out whole on the other side. And there are pictures after 9/11 of the nose of one of the planes that came out whole. Came out whole, which is impossible since the windows, I was in the World Trade Center, one of them, before it was blown up. I was in it in let me get the year correct. It was 1987, the summer of 87. And the windows aren't that wide. There is no way a 12-foot nose of a plane could go through one and not be sliced in pieces. Just absolutely no way. And then you have these strange things like that. Nothing survived on the plane. No one's passport survived except one of the terrorists. His passport just popped out of his luggage, went through this fireball of the impact on the tower, landed in the street after and was found completely without even a stain on it. Now, is that probable? So her conclusion is that it was a deep state op. Those people were all murdered. And the purpose of it was shock, terrorize the entire nation so that then they would agree to, I don't know, is it $1 or $2 trillion of military spending to build up the military industrial complex? That Bush knew about it. In that interview with her, you will see a tape where Bush was asked, did you know this was going to happen beforehand? And you look at his reaction and you can clearly see that he's saying, yes, I knew about it, but I can't admit that. So he knew about it. And that means these people are mass murders because in consequence of 9/11, they bombed tens of thousands of people to death in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq, and Pakistan for no reason at all. Those people had nothing to do with it. The attack didn't come from Afghanistan. It came from the CIA.
And a building that was never touched also
Oh yeah, Building 7. So you know there's two towers, the World Trade Centers. Well, between them, there's a thing called Building 7. And Building 7 collapsed all by itself, they told us. But the video shows clearly it was detonated by a controlled detonation that is done when you demolish buildings. But it wasn't demolished by any detonation company that we know of. Now it's come out after all these years that who had an office in that building? The CIA. And who had access to the structure of that building at any time? The CIA. But other interesting things in that building. What was in that building? The offices of the FBI's New York office. And in their office, they had the evidence for 10,000 cases that was all destroyed. Isn't that convenient? And what was one thing they were investigating? They were investigating the relationship with George Bush and Osama bin Laden. So we've shown clearly now that the Third Reich was funded by the Harrimans, that the Bush family are agents of the Harrimans. The Harrimans involved in eugenics and Planned Parenthood, and the CIA and military intelligence, and that these people saved the entire Nazi operative spy network and brought them into the US government, and who knows what they're running in the United States. Some interesting other details. Thyssen, after the war, doesn't have his assets confiscated, but he ends up dying where? In Argentina. Buenos Aires, Argentina. And according to the National Geographic, this is not me saying it, National Geographic now, Hitler didn't die in the bunker in Berlin. He was whisked out and transported to Argentina, where he died in the western Argentina in about the year 1962. And that the FBI knew about it and never did anything about it. Now, why would that be? Unless, of course, the US government had already been infiltrated by the Nazis. So here we have the whole plan. Remember, Hitler said the party will return as a religion, okay? So now we have to connect a few more dots. So what family was made wealthy because of the connections with Planned Parenthood? It was the Gates family. Bill Gates was, a young do-nothing, mindless twit. His mother was like this with Planned Parenthood and the Harrimans. And so he's told to start Microsoft, that is given all these lucrative contracts by the IBM and becomes super wealthy. And the company goes public. I remember when Microsoft went public. I said it's a useless company and they probably won't be able to sell $1 billion of stock. They sold $65 billion worth of stock in a few days. I bet if you look into that, you'll find that the Brown brothers Harriman had something to do with that. And Bill Gates then, presto magico, after this long career in computers, gives all his money to the Microsoft Foundation and announces he's going to save the world with vaccines. Save the world vaccines, and even says that it will help reduce the world's population by 1 or 2 billion. He wants to kill 1 or 2 billion with his vaccines. So, well, we know, and you've seen many reports, Fauci is like this with the Bill Gates. The entire COVID scam has Bill Gates' fingerprints all over it. But here's something you didn't know. After the stock market crashed, there was a man in New York City who had built a few houses. And he needed money. So he goes over to the Brown brothers Harriman and he asks for a loan, financing. And that enables him to get not only contracts, he magico presto gets contracts to build, I think, something like 42,000 units of housing for the Navy during the Second World War. Because the Harrimans, one of his daughters married the Secretary of Commerce. And what is the name of this man?
Fred Trump.
Is that a coincidence, or is he a relation to you-know-who?
He is the father of the president.
Donald Trump is the son of a man who gives a Masonic handshake to Harryman,
Mm-hmm.
Skull and Bones.
Mm-hmm.
So the Trump family, who's gotten all these amazing loans over the years that no one else would get, even if they went bankrupt one time, he's gone bankrupt 6 times, is an ally or a servant of the Skull and Bones Bank.
Mm-hmm.
And the heiress of this same family is behind the eugenics movement,
Mm-hmm.
Planned Parenthood, abortion, and the vaccine industry.
Yep.
So is it at all surprising that Bush is just so pro-vaccine?
No.
And AJ, in your opinion, if Bush is reelected, is he going to push the vaccine?
Yeah, if you mean Trump, yes.
Excuse me, if Trump is reelected, do you think he's going to push that?
Oh, yeah.
Excuse me, I'm running on my batteries. And why would he not push it? He is the son of an ally of the same family that made the Bush family wealthy, that made the Gates family wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
So here we are in the front now of COVID-19. We know it's a complete scam. It was planned by the Rockefellers, who were like this with the Harrimans, and like this with the Bushes. And Soros is involved. He's also Bilderberger, Freemason, and he's like this with Trump. He put 140 million in Trump's hotel in Chicago, and he spent 30 million to defeat Tom Cruise,
Ted Cruz.
Ted Cruz, so that Trump would win the presidential nomination for the Republican Party in 2016. And Soros also spent, I think, 30 million to fund Black Lives Matter and Antifa.
Mm-hmm.
You still with me, AJ?
Yeah.
Okay. And Trump doesn't do anything about Antifa.
Nope.
Indeed, the other day, wasn't it Gingrich was saying on Fox News that that Soros has funded it, Black Lives Matter and Antifa, and he needs to be arrested?
Yep.
And what happened with the Fox News people?
They cut Gingrich sound and feed to silence him.
It looked like the Fox News anchoress, what was the name of that black lady?
Harris Faulkner.
Yeah, who is rather excellent. It looks like all of a sudden someone is shouting in her ear. Her whole expression, she looks absolutely terrified. So Soros is not someone you can bring to the public attention on Fox, and Fox is supposed to be fair and balanced. So here we are in the presence of the fact, we have to admit in America now that the Fourth Reich has come.
Mm-hmm.
But the Nazi Party didn't originate in Germany. It originated in the Brown Brothers and Harrison Bank in New York. It is a skull and bones op. And maybe this is why the symbol of the Waffen-SS is
Skull and bones.
Isn't that a coincidence? And that means that a vote for Trump or a vote for Biden is going to have the same result, the Fourth Reich. And it's going to be mandatory vaccination, your genetic sterilization or destruction, and your death and the complete destruction of any part of the economy they don't control.
Mm-hmm.
That's why Amazon and all the big box chains, they're allowed to open, but the little guy must shut down.
Mm-hmm.
And we have not made this program to terrorize you. We've made this program to red pill you.
Mm-hmm.
Because now you can see that if you don't immediately start organizing a militia in your town to oppose the vaccine, if you don't immediately organize join with a Christian party or organize a Christian party, you're going to be exterminated. And I am not joking with you. We're not joking with you. Ordo Militaris Catholics is about defending the rights of Christians who are being persecuted and terrorized. And this is what's happening now world over. The Masonic lodges now have control over nearly all the nations.
Mm-hmm.
And their plan is the same thing. And this is their game. And they know what's coming. I was just engaged the other day on Twitter, and someone told me that what we need is absolutist corporatism, and from that will come the restoration of monarchy. And I have to say that I've never heard the phrase absolutist corporatism. And this is by someone who's pretending to be a Catholic. So I looked up, what is absolutist corporatism? Well, it's that form of government that the Nazis had. And once Germany was organized with corporate solidarism, they had their monarch. And what was his name? It was Adolf Hitler. So these people know exactly what they're working for, and they're working for the reign of the Antichrist on earth, who will be, maybe he'll be one of the physical descendants of Adolf Hitler. I don't know. But it looks like this will be the Fourth Reich, and that Trump is one of the best actors, but he has $170 million from George Soros, and we don't know how much money from the Harryman family and all the others. And if you think he's there to help you, I think we've given you enough evidence to show that these people are psychopaths. They don't care that they're of killing hundreds of millions or even billions. They're going to have their agenda. And America's not the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Yeah.
It is the plantation of the Skull and Bones Masonic Lodge.
Before we go,
And
I want to get justice for Gareth Jones. Who killed him?
who do you think killed him, AJ?
Skull and Bones Bush, and he was connected to the. You told me of a man who was working with Bush and Prescott from Harryman, who took the excess grain from the Soviet Union.
Yeah, we'll add a little of that so people think about it. There is another person who, after the stock market crash, became very wealthy. Now, I mentioned I knew something about the stock market crash, and now I'll tell you about it. Just as AJ's grandfather worked on the car of General Patton, and by divine providence, AJ and I met here to form the Ordo Militaris by divine inspiration, I think. My grandfather worked as a waiter in one of the fanciest hotels in Atlantic City. And his clients weren't wealthy people. They were super wealthy people. And this is what my grandfather told me. I asked my grandfather one day, since you've always invested in stocks, did you invest before the great crash of 29? He says, yes, I did. I said, you must have lost everything. He said, no, I lost no money in the crash. I said, Grandpa, how did you not lose anything? He said, in May of 1929, because the stock market crashed in October, my clients told me to take my money out of the market because it was going to crash. Now contemplate that. Now, a documentary came out in the 80s and 90s. You can't find anything about this anymore, but I remember I saw it on television in the US. And this, I think he was a stockbroker. He investigated the history of the stock market crash, and he found out that it was planned by a group of Freemasons in New York City, one of whom was the Forbes family, who runs the Forbes magazine and Forbes.com today. Or at least they used to. They gave their name to it. Scottish Rite Freemasons. They planned the stock market crash and became super wealthy on it because what they did is they bought options. First, they started manipulating the market up and down for like 6 months in advance. And they did this to hide, to create a whole cover for what they were doing. And they never lost money on these manipulations, because when the market was high, they'd buy an option, which allowed them to sell a certain amount of stock held by a brokerage at the high price. And then when the market went down, buy the same number of shares and give it back to the brokerage. And they made the difference. So every time the stock market went up and down, they were making tons of money selling short. It's called selling short as an option. When the stock market crash came, they got all their money out of the market, and then they bought things for penny on the dollar, and they became super wealthy. And the Harrymans became very wealthy after the stock market crash. Well, we see they buy up the Brown Brothers bank in Philadelphia. But another family became very wealthy, and that was Arm and Hammer. And Arm and Hammer came from a family in the Midwest. His father was a Marxist. He's Jewish, and he's a Freemason. And in 1931, he goes to Russia. And what does he do? He sells them medical equipment in exchange for grain. And then in years of shortages, he sells them grain. But at the end, just as the Holodomor is beginning, he dedicates it to exporting grain to the United States from Russia. So we were finding out who was behind the export of this grain. Where did it go? So now we know where it went. It went for Arm and Hammer is the one who made the money off of the starvation to death of 20 million Christians in the Ukraine. Okay. Forbes, before he founded his newspaper, what is it? Forbes was a minor newspaper writer in Scotland. He moves to South Africa in 1902. Works in a newspaper founded by a Jew and then is bought out by another Scott Wright Mason. And then 2 years later gets sent to New York, works for the Journal of Commerce, and the Journal of Commerce is in their offices that the Federal Reserve Bank was planned, okay? Then he works for Hearst news agencies, who are the ones that employed Durante, the opponent of
Garrett.
And Garrett. And then he goes on to found his own journal, where he gets the money from, who's to say, that goes on to engineer the stock market crash a decade later. Okay, so all this is tied together. The stock market crash enabled companies to become extraordinarily wealthy because they bought pennies on the dollar, everything up. And after the stock market crash, they eliminated in US law the ability of any little company of selling the stock. Any little company, because you know it was little companies that caused the market to crash. No, it wasn't. It was the ultra wealthy, and they got away with it. The Forbes family was never prosecuted. The people involved in the conspiracy were never prosecuted for crashing the market in '29. So that's just a little detail in the stock market crash. The Holodomor. Remember, as we said, Freemasonry is an alliance between Protestants and Jews, both who are dedicated to destroying Christianity. The Protestants are dedicated to destroying Christianity in the Roman Church, and the Jews, their part was destroying Christianity in the Orthodox world through the Russians, through the Marxists. And this is why it shouldn't surprise you that China is the start of the COVID crisis, and yet at the same time heavily invested with both the US deep state and Bill Gates' interests. It's all one and the same. There isn't a war between the West and the East, between democracy and Marxism. We are all being exploited ruthlessly by the Masonic Lodge. That's the real history of the 20th and 21st centuries.
Yep. So if you want to do something about it, folks, join the Christian Party of America. You can go to christianparty.org for America. Let's see. Let's get the right link here for you, folks.
Christian Party for FOR America.wordpress.com.
Yep.
And we need to organize a Christian party as fast as possible, or we're going to be exterminated. At the same time, and that's something you can do. We do a show every Tuesday about that, and we're not just talking here, folks. You've got to wake up, and we hope you spread this show far and wide. The other thing you can do is join Ordo Militaris Catholicus, support and invest in Ordo Militaris Inc., because we are an organization that is dedicated to defending Christians against all enemies. And we're bringing you this news to red pill you so you know what's really going on. We would love in Ordo Militaris to build fortified Catholic communities in the countryside where you're not going to be exterminated or forced to be vaccinated, and where Freemasonry won't get control of you, where we can have our own banks and financial freedom to begin town by town rebuilding America, defending Christianity. The Christian Party, for anyone who wants to join it anywhere in the United States, Catholic or non-Catholic. We call it the Catholic Party of America because Catholics name the name of the church Christ founded, and Christians the name of the believer. And we have to work together. And we have to work together as believers. So you can see at christianpartyforamerica.wordpress.com some of the ideas AJ's had about many things that you could do in government. And if you read it, you'll be totally blown away how different Christian politics is from Masonic. How Christian politics is about building up and defending people, not exploiting them like vicious vampires, godless murderers, and Nazi pigs. And whoever you are, you will probably realize that if you want to be saved, you want a Christian party running your country, because Christians won't exterminate you. The Freemasons are now planning to exterminate you. Okay, so whether your grandfather or great-grandfather or brothers or sisters were Masons or are Masons, these people aren't playing for games. We're not talking about the low-level Masons that aren't involved in the craft. We're talking about the people who've been in it and have all the money and view America as their garden that they can hoe over when they want to. And that's what they're planning to do. So those are two excellent ways you can respond to the truth we told you about in this program. Support the Christian Party of America, or invest in Ordo Militaris Inc., Montana Corporation, perfectly legal, so that we can look at our Crusader option. You can find that on our news page, so that we can build fortified communities, or just invest in our Y stock so we can build training centers, so that we can organize Christian militia. So any governor, any mayor, any chief of police who wants troops to defend him against the New World Order, against the Skull and Bones, Fourth Reich, will have an organized militia that knows how to fight. There's not much time now. You need to wake up and realize within a year or 2 years, you may not be alive. You may have no property. They might come door to door and gun you down. And these are the solutions now. And if you don't use them, then you've chosen death. You've chosen slavery. And you've chosen the reign of the Antichrist. You've chosen to serve him because you've chosen not to resist him.
Yep. And to join the party, all you gotta do is, please read all the information, watch our 3 shows, I think, already. Then go to the homepage, scroll all the way down, use that contact form, and let us know. And we have meetings Mondays on 12:15 p.m. Central Time, and Fridays at 3 p.m. Central Time. So.
Yeah, and we hope to grow as much as we can and organize the party as soon as possible. For Ordo Militaris, the stock or this Crusade option, go to ordo-militaris.us, because the radio station's .net. .us is our corporate site, and consider pledging as a member of the order or becoming an investor and buying our stock. And but above all, share this video or this audio program. Make them go viral.
Yep.
Tell everyone that they have to stop and drop everything to know what's really going on in the country, because as far as I know, this is the only program that has laid out all the evidence of what's really going on. And you can see we've laid it out in a calm, rational way. We don't believe in, UFOs or crazy conspiracies. We're just telling you the facts, connecting the dots.
Mm-hmm.
And we're leaving you to make the judgments. But it's pretty obvious what's going on and who's on what side, and how you have to break out of stop drinking the Kool-Aid that voting for one of these two parties is going to save you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And or that Antifa and Black Lives Matter are the enemies of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
It's all political theater to get you distracted, so then they really would just want to stick you with that vaccine and suffocate you to death with that mask. That's what the only thing they care about right now, because they actually belong to an organization that wants to reduce the population of the world to 1 billion. So that means they have to kill 8 billion people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It'd be too messy if you had a war. They would lose because they're just a small few people. So the time is short. You need to act. Break out of the idea that you can just watch something on television and the world will go on the same. You got to do something. You have to break out of the MK Ultra tactics that have turned you into a couch potato, eviscerated, emasculated piece of nothing who, just look at the young people today. They comb their hair like they're cartoon figures. They don't even know how to punch because they made punching illegal. They don't know how to fight or defend themselves. So we need a radical return to sanity, and that's only going to come by loyalty to Jesus Christ and to defending ourselves, not relying on the government. The government is the enemy. I hate to say it. Not everyone in the government, the people who control the government, have made it a tool of their purposes, and it's not just happened yesterday. This has been long in the planning, long.
Yeah.
And so their control is deep and nearly total. You probably can only trust your local sheriffs and your local elected officials if you can red pill them.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they will turn you in too.
Yeah. This is Order Militarist Radio TV signing off. Des Volt.
Des Volt.